Dr. Keith Suter is known to many of us as the international affairs reporter on Channel 7's Sunrise program. He's also what's known as a futurist, which I believe is more sophisticated than the old days of staring at tea leaves and pulling apart the gizzards of birds. They actually look at what's at play in the dynamic that is human life and geopolitics and the world at large, and tell us what may be about to happen. He's a wonderful thinker. He's a part of a club in Rome known as the Exclusive Club with a capital E, and I can only imagine that that's quite exclusive. It has Mikhail Gorbachev in it, and he has just come from the largest media centre on earth ever built here in Australia. No, sorry, ever on earth, he told me. Bigger than the London Olympics Media Centre for the G20 in Brisbane. That's why he arrived at about 1 a.m. this morning. Please put your hands together for Dr. Keith Suter.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I join with others in recognising the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge the traditional custodians. There is a handout on your chairs. I'm going to speak to that handout. What I want to do is to put in perspective the Sister Cities movement, then argue that in fact there's a lot of good news that we simply don't cover in the media. Then I'm going to look at why the media distorts our perception of the world. And then to look at what we actually mean, I think, by signs of peaceful coexistence, and conclude with some comments about the role of cities in working for a more peaceful world. So the importance of the Sister Cities movement began, as we've heard, President Eisenhower in the 1950s, to increase international understanding and foster peace by furthering international communication and exchange at the person-to-person level through city-to-city affiliations. And we'll learn more about the background to the President's thinking in a presentation tomorrow. President Eisenhower in the 1950s was particularly concerned to improve the relations between the United States and Japan. And I also note that Australia has been a pioneer in improving relations with sister cities. So getting on to the overview of what I want to cover, this is a good time to be alive. Now, President Obama at the G20 argued that, as I am doing here, that people are richer, living longer, living better. People have also got higher IQs. The President didn't mention that, but I am. This is called the Flynn effect from a specialist in New Zealand who argues that, in fact, we're all getting more intelligent as the years roll by. And, of course, there are greater opportunities. I've got to say in my coverage for Channel 7 that what was interesting about having a black president give the speech at the Brisbane Convention Centre and then also at the University of Queensland. In World War II, Brisbane was the centre of the American war effort in terms of going to war against Japan. So from 43 to 45, there were pretty well more Americans in the city of Brisbane than there were actually Australians. And Brisbane was a segregated city, not because of Australian regulations, but because of American military regulations. America basically took over the town. They built the railway system. They also said that the city of Brisbane, which is mainly to the north of the river, would be only for the whites and blacks. The black American forces, because American forces were segregated, they had to be kept south of the river. And what was interesting is that, of course, the blacks, with their interest in jazz, etc., developed the southern part of Brisbane as the entertainment hub of the city, which it continues to be to this day. And that's where we also, coincidentally, have the Brisbane Convention Centre. But I thought it was a sign of the improvement that here we have, as the first ever American president to be giving a major presentation in Brisbane, that we have a black president giving a speech in an area that he would previously, in 1943, been banned from 70 years earlier. So that is actually a sign of the progress that we're making in terms of the reduction, in this case, of racial discrimination. So it's a good time to be alive. The world is becoming a safer place. I know you don't get that impression from me in the mornings when you're watching Sunrise, so I'm going to explain why the world has a distorted perception because of the media coverage. The good news gets hidden by the bad news. And then I want to look at the role of the cities in working for peaceful coexistence. So let's look at the good news that gets obscured by the bad news. There is progress being made in global peace. So the world is becoming a safer place. Be wary of the media's interest in war stories because bad news sells and good news does not. Remember, we have to respond to what our viewers want. And if I were to go on TV in the mornings and keep saying, well, we've got all this good news being made, there would be complaints that I'd be boring. You want to be scared. So my role is to scare you in the morning. We actually have fewer international conventional wars. No one ever believes this. The most dangerous time to have lived between 1914 and 2014 is 1914, the outbreak of World War I, until 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War. From 1950 onwards, we get a reduction in the total number of wars. They're the figures, but nobody's ever interested in facts. But they're the figures. A reduction in the total number of wars, a reduction in the total number of people killed in wars. And most people can now go through life without any direct experience of warfare. Yes, there is a risk of terrorism, but we should not overestimate it. 3,000 people died on 9/11 in 2001, but 30,000 Americans die each year through domestic gun use. 5,000 die each year through food poisoning, and more Americans were murdered by their partners in 2001 than killed by terrorists. So we need to get those figures of terrorism in perspective. I can give you heaps of other figures. For example, the average American stands a greater chance of dying in their bath than being killed by a terrorist. So if you visit the United States, don't eat the food and don't take a bath, which for an Englishman is good advice. Tony Wheeler, in his presentation, made a comment about the Europa Hotel in Belfast being the most bombed hotel in the world. And on one occasion when I was there in 1974, lo and behold, it got blown up. But it's worth bearing in mind that with Northern Ireland, with the exception of 1972, more people were killed on the roads of Northern Ireland than were killed in the conflict. But that's not the impressions you would get from the media. And particularly if you blow up a hotel containing journalists, you get coverage. But you actually were safer in that hotel than out on the roads of Northern Ireland. So we need to keep these figures in perspective. There is progress being made in global peace. So my argument is we should not focus so much on the negative. Don't misread the lessons of history. I'm getting a lot of comments on my radio programs that 1930s depression led to World War II, and so another war is coming. But I think the global financial crisis has been different. The European states are not rearming. In fact, they're being disarmed by the austerity measures. So there's no fresh Hitler causing problems in Europe. And no European state has an aggressive ideology. Europeans have learned their lesson. It's as simple as that. They have learned their lesson. It's very rare for conflicts to be fought, unless, tragically, they are domestic conflicts, as we've seen in Northern Ireland or in former Yugoslavia. And Tony showed us the bridge over Mostar, the new one, because the traditional one had been destroyed by the civil conflict within those countries. Yes, there is more civil unrest, and the media report it quicker, such as the Middle East. But there's also been another trend emerging that countries would rather trade than fight. And I'll explore that in more detail. Before getting on to that, let's just look at the problems with the media. Number 5, the mass media. What is the essence of the media? It's the process of communication of information, true or false, beyond one person. So what I'm doing this morning is a form of mass media. Radio, TV, the human voice, public meetings, they're all, the internet now, are all examples of the mass media. The media are our eyes and ears on the world. So I know what I had for breakfast this morning, I was there at the time, but I don't know what happened in Washington, Paris or London. I have to rely on the media to tell me. And the media also filter facts and make sense of the world for us. So the media provide the first draft of history. The technical term here is that we create the dominant paradigm. It's how you view the world. And that's the role of the media, to help you make sense of the world. So we are surrounded by filtering mechanisms, and the media are part of those filtering mechanisms, because you are bombarded from the first day of birth, some say even while you're still in the womb, with lots and lots of information. Some of it's sound, some of it's feeling, some of it's visual, some of it's smell. You are bombarded, and so you're overwhelmed. So the media provide a filtering mechanism. So what we're doing then is providing you with your way of trying to understand the world, make sense of the world. So let's look at number 6, which is the difference between news and noise. News is a commodity. It is made. We make the news. It doesn't occur automatically. And the news is made in different ways for different audiences at the same time. So, for example, going back to my experience at the G20, for people in Australia, we were running stories on Friday about the Russian warships off the Queensland coast, because we knew that Australians would be interested in Russian warships. Many other countries in their media, and remember I was in the largest media centre ever built on earth, I was able to mix with all these other journalists from a variety of countries around the world. A good many of them just ignored it. They said, well, it's not a story for us. We're not interested in Russians. The Chinese weren't interested. So it's very interesting how everybody then is looking at the world somewhat differently. And so we have to make the news. And so every evening on the news or every morning, we have in our media outlets to select certain stories and we ignore others. So, for example, going back to the tragedy in Boston with the Boston bombing, 3 people were killed in the Boston bombing. On that same day, in Waco, Texas, 15 people were killed in an industrial accident in a factory which had not been checked by government health workers for decades, because there's no money to finance work health and safety. So 3 people get killed in Boston, and we close down the 9th largest city in the United States. The tragedy in Waco involving 15 people, 5 times more the number, not a story. That's an industrial accident. That happens all the time. Every week in the United States, a bridge falls down. There are 50,000 bridges in the United States that are unsafe to travel over, but can't be closed down because there's no money to rebuild them. So on average, 1 bridge a week collapses in the United States. Never go over a bridge behind a heavily laden truck. Not a story. So we're telling you, again, we're helping to frame your world for you, but based on what you want to hear. You want to hear terrorism stories, we'll give you that. You're not interested in hearing stories about people being killed in factory accidents. Boring. So news is a commodity. You've got to bear that in mind. We make the news. So you need to distinguish between news and noise. So news, I think, but then I do foreign affairs, news for me is what's going on in the world. I think what constitutes noise are things like celebrity gossip, political hijinks, and sport. Even watching ABC 24 this morning, and the ABC are snobs, they look down on us in commercial TV. But look at one of the recurring stories on ABC News 24 is the 3 leaders of Australia, the United States and Japan trying to shake hands. And Obama clearly didn't know what to do with one of his spare hands. So the poor guy was at a bit of a loose end there. That's the story on the political hijinks. I'm so glad we have politicians here. You're now part of the television entertainment industry, John. Yeah. So we're interested in John's sex life and his financial skills. I've never met the guy, so I don't know what he's up to. But I'm assuming that he must be involved in all sorts of financial irregulations, sexual irregulations, criminal things. Now, he may well be making great speeches on sensible topics, dealing with, infrastructure in Western Australia. We're not going to give any coverage to that. But as soon as you get run into trouble with a young 18-year-old intern, we'll be after you. But you see what I'm getting at there? You have these substantive stories, and they get lost in the stories on what I regard as just noise, or the celebrity gossip, etc. I'm on TV in the morning, I get 3 minutes. My colleague from Hollywood gets 2 lots of 3 minutes. My story gets dropped, we will never drop Hollywood. There will always be stuff coming out of Hollywood. We also now have the 24-hour broadcasting, which has replaced the more static, formalised programming. Some of the older members of the audience here will remember how we used to gather around as a family to look at a little box in the corner, probably have dinner as well, looking at what was going on. And that was a way for parents to help children make sense of what they were seeing on the television. That's the old style of news coverage. So in other words, we were feasting on the news. Now we graze on it. It's a 24-hour news coverage. The problem is that we have to keep tweaking the story to keep the people already watching it interested, as well as making it new for the new audience clicking in. So if you were watching me over the last 3 days in Brisbane, I was talking about presidential limousines, Air Force One, all sorts of small stuff really, but we've got to fill up 24 hours. It's actually very difficult to fill up 24 hours, particularly when there's so little of a good news story. Remember how we had Mel standing outside the maternity hospital in London looking at what was said to be the most famous store in the world that week, waiting for somebody to come out and tell us that the princess had given birth to a baby, and she was running late. Those of you who've seen the King's speech, there's an incident which is not recorded in the movie, but it's worth bearing in mind. 1936, we had 3 kings. And the first king, King George V, was dying and was taking an awfully long time to die. That scene is in the film. What's not in the film is the editor of the Times of London rang from London to the doctor and said, "Has the king died yet? I've got a deadline to meet. I've got to announce it in my newspaper." And the doctor said, "No, he hasn't died." Well, he says, "Well, when is he going to die? I've got a deadline." So the doctor then went into the king's bedroom, gave the king an additional dose of painkiller, and was able to come back and tell the editor of the Times, "I regret to inform you that the king has died." That was then the story. You see how the news is made, the importance of the media, etc. So, big stories can be submerged under the noise. The events that affect our lives are long-term issues which rarely get onto the front page of the West Australian newspaper or the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald. And particularly good news is not news. News programs are now basically part of entertainment. The language of war has entered sport, and the language of sport has entered politics. People are less interested in who is right or wrong, but who is going to win. Sports people are now the national heroes, and not the politicians or military leaders. People want consumer goods and not national military glory. There's a new role for government now, is to improve the quality of life rather than to win wars. As George Bush Sr. found out, having become the most popular president in American history in 1991 because of the victory in Kuwait, nonetheless was defeated the following year by Bill Clinton, that great leader of men and follower of women, defeated the following year because he campaigned on the economy. So being a great military leader did not help George Bush Sr. get re-elected. So it's a new ball game now, that we are not really that interested in politics, we're more interested in sport. And it reflects the fact that we really don't have major problems to address. Again, of course, the media will say, we've got lots of problems in Australia. Australia basically has luxury problems. The leader of Russia or China or the United States could really run Australia on his day off for a bit of a break. We do not have major problems. There are real issues. That obviously, the low life expectancy of Indigenous peoples is a problem, but nobody knows how to solve that. So we have luxury problems in this country. And also it means that journalists focus too often on personalities rather than policies. So we have a very personality-driven style of politics. We have a presidential system of politics, but a parliamentary system of government. Which is why a lot of people, when I was broadcasting, were ringing in saying, how can the Labor Party sack Kevin Rudd? I voted for him, but you didn't. You voted for your local Member of Parliament in the Commonwealth Parliament, who, if he or she were a member of the Labor Party, would then have put Kevin Rudd in power as Prime Minister. You didn't vote for Kevin Rudd. You voted for your local Member of Parliament. The average Australian is confused about how politics is conducted in this country. But there are problems in the United States as well. More Americans vote in American Idol each year than vote in presidential elections. So there is this low level of voter engagement. The big stories, such as the world becoming more peaceful, just gets obscured. So let's look at the way in which the world is becoming more peaceful. We've got this remarkable global economic boom. This is President Eisenhower's vision. Remember, the president had lived through the Depression of the 1930s, then the destruction of the 1940s in World War II. He really wanted America and the rest of the world to become a much more prosperous country. And when he died, America was much richer than it had ever been before in its history, and a fairer society. It's interesting, under President Eisenhower, the highest marginal tax rate was 87 cents in the dollar. Very interesting. It was a later president, Ronald Reagan, that began to cut back on taxation. But President Eisenhower was a high-taxing president who believed in infrastructure. And you notice that when you go to the United States and you see the road-building program that the president created. It's, of course, the lack of funding since the president that we've ended up with all the infrastructure issues that we've got now, such as the collapsing bridges. So under number 8, number 1, never before have so many people around the globe gained so much wealth in so little time. There may be a growing gap between rich and poor, but the rich are getting richer and so are the poor. I've worked for 30 years in social welfare. Our clients nowadays carry mobile phones. So they are richer than they would have been decades ago. Now, I agree there's a gap between the rich and the poor, but the poor are richer today than they would have been 30 or 40 years ago. When I was selling encyclopedias in the United States as a vacation job, when I was in Boston in 1970, when I went into a home to sell encyclopedias, I had to check that there was a telephone. Because in those days in the United States, having a telephone was the cut-off point between being rich and poor. Now most American homes have at least 2 telephones, a landline as well as a mobile phone. So it shows how people are getting richer in the United States, and of course here in Australia as well. So number 1 is the increased wealth. Number 2 is the democratisation of wealth. People now expect to get rich. They desire to better themselves, and so they are not resigned to a fate of poverty. This is a very radical statement, the idea that somehow you can live better than your parents or your grandparents. For hundreds of years in European history, this would have seemed inconceivable, because in those days people were born into a certain class and died in a certain class. There was no movement. And besides, there was nothing to spend your money on. You know, there were no dentists 500 years ago. You would have suffered along with everybody else if you had toothache. So there was a static society which began to change in Europe about 200 years ago. And now we're seeing it in other parts around the world, that people are saying, yes, I can become richer. And we're seeing it also with the education of young girls. It's interesting that the biggest threat to the Taliban in Afghanistan is a young girl with a book, Masala, who won the Nobel Peace Prize this year. So people are changing their expectations. They're expecting to get richer. Number 3, technology has had a continuous trend towards improvement of the quality of human life. The faster the science advances, the quicker capital accumulates. At this year's Club of Rome meeting, hosted by the Mexican government, we had a very interesting presentation on Google cars. Very interesting. Google reckons that by 15 years' time, nobody will be driving a car. In fact, I was talking to Tony. His wife has just bought a mini car or whatever it is, which parks itself. This is the beginning of the Google car business. In other words, as the driver goes through the street, the car will tell you, there's no need to steer, take your hands off the wheel, I'll do it from here on in. And it is able to sense where the spot is and parks itself. In 15 years' time, nobody in this room will be driving a car. And of course, when people say, oh, I wouldn't trust a computer with driving me on the roads, 1.3 million people die on the roads each year. Greater danger than terrorism. So the bar has been set very low by humans. A computer doesn't have to be all that smart to beat the humans. 15 years' time. That'll be transforming. It means you won't need to have flash cars. Your car will be a commodity. You'll call it up on your phone. You'll go to the conference facility or wherever. As you get out, your bank account will be debited. The car will move off somewhere else for the next customer. When you want the car to get you home from the conference, just call it up. A car will arrive, get you home, debit your bank account, and you'll go off somewhere else. So this is what's looking at for 15 years' time. A reduction in the number of people dying on the roads, a reduction in the number of cars needing to be built. Again, a transformation of those. If you think about it, the average car only moves for 2% of its existence. The 98% of it's in a parking lot somewhere. So it's going to be a much more economical use of resources. So that's the impact of technology. I could speak a lot more about technology. There's a lot there. And finally, number 4, we know what works for economic growth, which is some sort of market system, and what doesn't, which is communism. So the Chinese in 1976 decided to move towards some sort of market system. It's still got a long way to go, but they've got a market system. Myanmar, Burma, is the most recent recruit to the global economic system. So we've only got North Korea and Cuba to go. So basically, we've now got one common global economic system. So, remarkable economic growth. Let's look at this reduction in wars. We have fewer international wars and a reduction in the number of people killed in warfare since 1914. Why is this? We think it's because trade is knitting the world together. It's called the McDonald's Golden Arches theory of world peace. No country that sells McDonald's goes to war, which is why I keep predicting that we will not have a war between Russia and Ukraine. They're both selling McDonald's. Countries that sell fast food do not go to war against each other. There's no reflection that you eat fast food and you lose the capacity to fight. But it's simply that countries sign on to fast food corporations are signing on to free trade and globalisation. That's what our G20 conference in Brisbane was all about. Free trade, enabling the economy to grow. New Zealand signed, today we assume, the Australian Prime Minister will be signing a free trade agreement with President Xi, China, in Canberra. It'll be in a few hours' time. What is interesting is that New Zealand signed its own free trade agreement with China years ago. And New Zealand has had a tremendous increase in wealth. It's a growing economy. No more jokes about New Zealand being broke. New Zealand produces 1/4 of the world's milk. Sleepy little New Zealand. Population of 5 million people. That's an example about how free trade works. There are a lot of disadvantages to free trade. I'm involved with all sorts of debates on that. But overall, it's free trade that enables the wealth to continue. And it's interesting if you look at, for example, Western Europe, how it's been transformed since 1945. So in 1914, we get the First World War. More soldiers from Perth died per capita from Perth in that war than from any other location in the British Empire. So Western Australia has a close interest in World War I. Then you get World War II. Now, because of this McDonald's Golden Arches theory of world peace, we find the French and the Germans working closely together. For 1,000 years, they have fought each other, Franks and Huns, French and Germans, involving Australia on 2 occasions last century. Now that it's inconceivable they would ever go to war against each other. Why kill those people? They're our customers. So we see how trade knits the world together. Also, it's been suggested that it could be called the democratic peace theory. There are more democracies in the world than ever before. Democracies do not go to war. They do not fight each other. Tragically, they get involved in other people's wars, as we're seeing in the Middle East, incorrectly in my view. But they do not fight each other. Democracies do not fight each other. And it's interesting to look around the world and to see the change, even in our own region. Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, they have all been fascist dictatorships. They are now flourishing democracies. Indonesia is a very interesting country to watch. It has a gross national product, in aggregate terms, the same size as Australia. We've always been used to being number 1 in this region. Now we're going to have to get used to being number 2. So when John Howard referred to Australia as the regional sheriff, well, we're about to hand that badge over to another country, Indonesia. So it's interesting how we're also having to become accustomed to these changes on the world scene. So you can either have an economic interpretation, MacDonald's golden arches theory of world peace, or you could have a political science interpretation, the democratic peace theory. Whatever it is, there has been a reduction in conflict. Now, you won't get that impression from me because you want war, and I've got to give you a war each morning. But the world is becoming a safer place. And people themselves have moved from being subject, in other words, governed in a monarchy, to becoming a citizen, living, say, in a republic like the United States, and now they are a consumer. They like what global trade can produce. And increasingly, countries are knitted together because of the way in which they are having to produce goods and services to be bought and sold by other countries. So my final comment in this context is don't let fear ruin your life. After 9/11, there was an increase in the number of car trips because Americans stopped flying after 9/11. Tragically, there was an increase in car deaths. Fear had killed those people. They would have lived if they had stayed in the aircraft. Instead, they'd said, I'm not going to trust the aircraft, I'm going to drive, and they got killed on the roads. They were killed in the first instance by fear of terrorism. But remember, as I've already indicated, in terms of sheer figures, that fear is unjustified. And I am worried about how we're now getting our kids to grow up in a world where we make them so anxious. I remember growing up in post-war London. I was born in 1948. If those of you who've ever read the novel 1984 will know that George Orwell transposed the last 2 digits. So the talk of a city being ruined, shortage of good, clean water, and people smelling to high heaven. The British weren't having showers in those days either. The Germans had destroyed the bathrooms. That was the world in which I grew up. But it was a world in which, ironically, I could move around quite easily. My parents would give me my cheese sandwiches and I'd go train spotting. If my parents did that nowadays, they'd be up for child neglect. But of course, if you'd said to my parents, you've got to take greater control over your child, they would have said, look, we've just lived through 6 years of German bombing. We're not going to be terrified. But the problem is that the British, having gone now since 1945 without a major conflict, have now become softer and more anxious and easier to scare. And thus we mollycoddle the children. I therefore welcome people like the work that Tony and his wife have been doing with Lonely Planet, encouraging people to explore the world. If you're overly anxious, you won't move out of your sitting room. And remember, it's dangerous to stay at home. That's where the murders take place. You're safer getting one of Tony's books and travelling around the world than staying at home and risk getting into trouble with your partner. So, to sum up then so far, before I move on to the final comments about the role of cities, what I've argued is the world is becoming a safer place. We are justified at this conference in talking about peaceful coexistence because it is a world of peaceful coexistence. We are approaching the vision that the President had 60 years ago when he saw the world being knitted together at people-to-people level. The Cold War is over. We're still having difficulty with the Russians, but I cannot imagine the Russians are going to invade Australia or anyone else any more than anyone's going to want to bother to invade Russia. Trade is knitting the world together. We've also got an increase in the number of democracies. The problem is that our perception of the world is distorted because of the media's infatuation with war and terror. But we do that because that's what you're interested in. If only citizens were more interested in peace, we would be able to have peace journalism, and we would be able to focus on the many good stories. One of the good stories is the reduction in the total number of people dying because of polio in the world. This is a good news story. I can't get any coverage for it on Channel 7. It's a good news story. When you think what a terrible disease polio used to be, it's now gone down to about 3 or 4 countries. So we're actually reducing the risk of polio. That's a good news story. Smallpox has been totally eradicated. And the Bill and Melinda Gates and World Health Organization are now working on eradicating malaria. Malaria killed more Australian soldiers in World War II than the Japanese did. Malaria is a real problem, and they are now focusing attention on that. These are good news stories. But my producer tells me you're not interested in that. You want to be scared in the morning. And thus we give you the daily diet of people who get murdered, the bank robberies. The crime rate, by the way, is going down in Australia, but you wouldn't guess that from the media. The world, as I say, is becoming safer, both at the international level and even at the local level. So President Eisenhower's vision of peaceful coexistence is coming slowly into fruition. It doesn't move as a straight line. The whole issue of the Islamic terrorism is clearly a major issue, not for us, more for the Islamic world. We're the collateral damage. The problem for the Americans is they think that everything that happens in the world has implications for America. And what America covers, we cover. It's really a problem for the Islamic world to come to terms with the modern world. It's an issue that we had in Europe for hundreds of years as the Catholics and Protestants are fighting it out. Now it's Sunni and Shia. It's worth bearing in mind the Islamic State kill far more Muslims each week than they kill Westerners. They have got to come to terms with the modern world. Perhaps they won't. You know, the messiahs of this world carrying their school textbooks. That's the threat for some of those old men who run the faith. So what I've tried to argue for the bulk of my presentation is just to look at the world differently and to check your own worldviews and your paradigms. That's a technical term, paradigm, worldview. Give you an example of what this is like. Nokia was a fine Finnish company, but it's run by engineers. So it's run by stale, pale males. But the old men at the top are smart enough to know they're not smart enough to know everything. So these old men employed a group of teenage advisors. Everything they worked on, they showed to the teenagers. Is there something in this prototype that you can see and we can't see? And Nokia invented texting, but they could never get it to work because they've got slow, fat fingers. I've never sent a text message. I've got slow, fat fingers. They showed it to their teenage advisors. It was a 15-year-old Finnish schoolboy who realised that Nokia had solved the basic problem of 15-year-olds throughout history. How do you invite a girl out for a date? You text her. He said to Nokia, continue with this, I think you're onto something. 7 billion text messages will be sent around the world today. A 15-year-old boy with hormones could see something that the stale, pale males could not see. That's the whole issue of paradigms and worldviews. We're all looking at the world differently. That's an argument, by the way, for workforces consisting of men and women, young and old, black and white, because we're all looking at the world differently. Now, what I've argued so far is to encourage you to look at the world differently and to focus on the peaceful coexistence that exists in this world. It's just that we don't give you adequate enough publicity to it, because in the media our job is to give you the bad news and not the good news. Let me just conclude with some comments about the role of cities. And I'm arguing that the cities are making a broad contribution to this new era of peaceful coexistence. Cities that promote global trade are contributing to this progress towards global peace. There is more to peace than just diplomats and military forces, and this is what President Eisenhower was getting at with the sister city idea, that you just can't leave peace to diplomats or the military forces. You must involve citizens in each country. Now, what is interesting is that peace research, which is an academic discipline that's been running for about the last 30 or 40 years, it's just stimulated a deeper awareness of what makes for peace. Peace is more than just the absence of war. It is the presence of justice and economic and social progress. I actually talk about a triangle of peace. One side of the triangle is disarmament. A second side of the triangle is economic and social progress, and the bottom end is conflict resolution. You can't have governments disarming in a security vacuum. We have to develop alternative ways of achieving security. And you've also got to have economic and social justice as well. Security, therefore, is more than just safety from terrorist attacks. People need to feel comfortable in their location. There has to be a sense of community. Having just come from Brisbane in the G20, admittedly with excessive police regulation, but what is interesting is the German leader, Angela Merkel, went on that walkabout and ended up taking a few selfies. She's actually now become the pin-up person, I think. Number one is Obama, number two is Angela Merkel, and the photographs taken of her, which are being beamed in Germany. That's the news story, not Russian ships off the Australian coastline. It's that they've got a president, a chancellor, prime minister, who's gone walkabout in Brisbane and come across a community, I think mainly of Germans, in the same way the Indian leader is going around having his photograph taken with Indians as well. It's one of the joys, as one of the diplomats said, it's one of the joys of coming to Australia. No matter where you've come from, you can always find a community grouping with whom you can have your photographs taken for the pictures back home for the media. Because that's what the journalists want. It's the local angle. Remember, all politics is local. So it's interesting that the Chancellor ran across these people and had her photograph taken. But she had that sense of safety. She felt that she could walk around the city with complete safety, knowing that she wasn't going to be shot at, etc. That's why there's this positive side to peace. It's not just sort of saying, well, we're removing war. You've actually got to feel more comfortable within yourself and to be in a society where you get economic and social progress. And clearly, if you look at what Brisbane is like compared with 100 years ago, with the problems that they had in Brisbane, clearly Brisbane is a safe city. And I might say the Australian government has been marketing Australia in the past few days as clean, green and safe. So we see, therefore, number 11 on the handout, the rise of localism, the rediscovery of the local. People want a sense of connectedness. In the year 1648, notice how precise we are in international law. In the year 1648, we invented a new system of government. So you would get a group of people called a nation, and then you had a state. So we're not talking about the state of Western Australia. Australia itself is the nation state. There are about 200 nation states or countries in the world. So you have a nation with a common history, common sense of identity, usually common language, and then the state. So the state would be politicians, judges, lawyers, bureaucrats, defence forces, police forces. That's 1648. That's when we invented this system of government. And so we've now taken that model around the world. As the Europeans started to move out in what's been the last 500 years, being the European era in global affairs, now coming to an end. But for the last 500 years, Europeans have run the world, which of course is why in a country of blackfellas, so many people in Australia are white, because they've moved from Europe. So that's our system of government. The problem with that system of government, with having a government either at the national capital in Canberra, which my listeners loathe, you've got to bear in mind that under international law, outer space begins at about 112 miles above the ground, which means, therefore, that Canberra is closer to outer space than it is to any major Australian city. It helps to explain some of the decisions. So people feel a sense of isolation from the national capital, even worse when you go to Europe, where you're talking about Luxembourg or Strasbourg or Brussels. So what we're seeing then is this rediscovery of the local. We've seen it in Scottish nationalism, we've seen it in Basque nationalism, etc. In an era of turbulence and insecurity, people want good local services, because such services provide that sense of security. A secure community at home is less likely to be an aggressive one overseas. Again, look at the transformation of Western Europe compared with the 1930s. My argument is that cities are the nerve endings of humanity, because cities are big enough to be major economic units, but they're small enough to enable people to feel secure and comfortable. And as you may know, as we speak at this very moment, for the first time in human history, more people now live in cities than live on the land. This is one of the big changes on planet Earth. So I emphasise the role of localism, which is why I'm always happy to be involved with local government activities, because that's, for me, is where the action is so often. So let me just conclude with a comment about the importance of soft power and the role of the cities. So there are two types of power. Hard power is military might. It's the capacity to coerce others into carrying out your instructions. So a lot of people, when they think of power, they think of hard power. Military forces, police forces, people with guns, etc. But there's also soft power, which is the role of culture to attract people to your cause. For example, Great Britain is no longer a global superpower, but it does have Shakespeare, the BBC, literary tourism, and cricket. They're all flourishing. So Britain is just as well known as ever, but with a different type of influence on the global scene. That is soft power. The United States has had problems in Iraq, but many Iraqis have operated on the basis of Americans go home and take me with you. The entertainment industry is America's biggest export industry, and Hollywood still makes the best dreams. So this is soft power. This is the power of attraction. It's people really wanting to be involved in what you're about. In the old days of the Cold War, I travelled extensively behind the Iron Curtain. What intrigued me was the way in which, when I was in Eastern Europe, people had very little interest in what was going on in Moscow. They were obliged to pay attention to Moscow, but there was no love of Moscow. Instead, they had an interest in American pop music, American movies, American fashion, because Hollywood makes the best dreams. And in 1990, I was in Stockholm for a conference at the Parliament, and I was talking to one of Mikhail Gorbachev's advisors about the way in which pizza was selling in Moscow. And as you may know, Gorbachev later on went on to do advertisements for pizza. But Gorbachev's advisor said that the reason the Russians were eating pizza in Moscow is they thought that when they were eating pizza, they were eating a piece of America. That's soft power, the power of attraction. And it's still the case today when you travel around the world. An inviting, hospitable city that draws people into the country is using soft power. For example, the Sydney 2000 Olympics or Brisbane and the G20. So that's the use of soft power. Travel increases the awareness of the globe. Ideally, gap year teenagers in developed countries should live in a deprived village in a developing country to really see just how lucky they are. I'm going for time. Can I just have a moment just to comment about this? Because a lot of people comment upon, the way that, I travel on world affairs, I get to travel around the world. My comment is that as a teenager, I was ruined for life. It's a phrase that I picked up listening to Father Pete Henriott, SJ. He was giving a talk to Americans who were going to serve in Africa as volunteers. And he was warning them, look, if you spent 2 hours a day collecting water from your village, when you get back to America, where you just go to the bathroom tap to get water, or the kitchen tap, You will not be able to take American problems seriously when you're looking at worries about girlfriends and boyfriends, automobiles, fashion, etc. You are ruined for life. And that's what happened to me. Not that I was an American volunteer in Africa, but because I took an early interest in world affairs, then I realised that living in Great Britain and for the last 40 years in Australia, that in effect I was living a very gifted and lucky life. But it's when you're exposed to what's going on overseas, in my case in politics, obviously, in the Lonely Planet, driving around looking at what was going on with a grassroots view of it, you get a broader view of the world. And one of the great advantages, it seems to me, for the Sister Cities movement is that we're able to expose people to what other places are like around the world. So travel increases the awareness of the globe. My final comment there is that cities are international peacekeeping organisations, increasing economic growth and maintaining international peace. So, in a sense, therefore, as I've argued that trade has been an important component of the Sister City movement. Trade knits the world together, makes the world a safer place, and therefore people who are involved in the Sister City movement are actually global peacekeepers. I salute you all. Thank you.